Hello everyone, my name is Robert Chalmers and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm making this video today as a summary version or a TLDR version of yesterday's video that I uploaded. And so that video was called Why the Christian God Cannot Exist. And in that video I use a simple math equation, algebraic equation with some variables, and then the Bible's own words to show why the Christian God cannot exist. And so I go into a lot of arguments in that video, but I realized after I got done recording it that it was almost 2 hours long, and I didn't expect my presentation to take that long, and so I apologize about that. So this is the short version. And so I'm basically going to break it down into a couple of arbitrary percentages. And so these aren't exact percentages of Christians, but they're just approximations. So you have 99% of Christians who have believed for the last 2,000 years that Jesus will return at some point in the future to not only transform their physical bodies into immortal, sinless, spiritual bodies if they're alive, but also if people are dead in the graves, that they'll be resurrected, and their bodies, they will also bodily be changed into an immortal, sinless body. And they also believe that when that happens at the second coming of Jesus, that the physical universe will also be turned into a paradise where there's no more pain, death, and suffering, and things like that. And that's what 99% of Christians have believed for the last 2,000 years. So the way that they do this is they ignore the time statements of the New Testament, and they say that the time statements don't require a first century fulfillment. So you have time statements in the New Testament that explicitly state that the Jesus character has to return and transform believers and the universe into a paradise in the first century before their lifetimes were over. And what the 99% of Christians have said is, no, you don't have to accept those time statements. They don't mean what they say. So I deal with their arguments against that and why they don't work and why you have to accept what the time statements plainly state. And then you have the 1% of Christians who are full preterists. And I was a full preterist the last 18 months that I was a Christian before, I deconverted and left Christianity. And so they correctly recognize, at least in my opinion, that you cannot get around the time statements. The time statements mean what they say, and that Jesus had to come back in the first century within the lifetimes of the disciples, because you have verses that explicitly state that. And so the full preterists accept that. And by the way, it's funny that the 99% pretty much consider the full preterists, the 1%, to be heretics. And they have throughout, the centuries. So, full preterists have mainly showed up in the last couple centuries, and especially in the last 50 or 60 years. But there was some in the 19th century. But the 99% think that the full preterists are heretics. But what the full preterists do is they accept the time statements, which I think you should, but they spiritualize the resurrection. They say that terms like body, it doesn't mean your physical body. It means Old Covenant Israel under the law of Moses. And when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, that's when the resurrection took place, and the resurrection was invisible. It meant that people who were in Hades, in the grave, that they got to leave when the temple was destroyed by the Romans and enter into heaven. And that was the spiritual second coming of Jesus, which he did through the Roman armies. And so they redefine terms like body, they redefine terms like death and resurrection and creation, and they say that those terms don't mean what they look like they say. And so with death, they say that's not a transformation of your physical body. Your body's going to rot in the grave forever, and that death will always be on this planet. It's never going to go away. It'll always be here, and that's simply just separation from God, and that in 70 AD, the dead were allowed to go into heaven, and that when you die, if you're a believer, you'll just get to immediately go to heaven, and there is no physical transformation of anything. So you can see why the 99% of Christians have not liked what the full preterists say and have called them heretics. Well, in my video, I also deal with why the resurrection is not spiritual, and that you should take the New Testament writers at face value and that they mean exactly what they say. They're talking about a bodily resurrection and a physical recreation of the universe into paradise where there's no more death or suffering. And that's exactly what the New Testament writers teach. But they also teach the time statements. So I deal with the arguments from the 99% why you can't get around the time statements like they try to do. And I also deal in depth with the arguments the full preterists use to try to change terms like body and death and resurrection and creation, and how their arguments don't work, and that the New Testament writers definitely teach a bodily resurrection and a physical change of the universe. So when you put those two things together, that Jesus had to return in the first century, but he also had to change the created universe into a paradise where there was no more death and suffering, that this proves that the Bible tells you in its own words that its God cannot exist. But I deal with these arguments in depth. I use an algebraic math equation to show this, and to show in the Bible's own words why its God cannot exist. Now, at the end of the video, I discuss who I think Paul and the first century Christians actually were. And I go into depth on this as well, and I basically come to the conclusion that Paul was a person who was prone to hallucinations. And there's a lot of clues about this in the scriptures, and I point out those verses in my longer video yesterday. So if you want all these in-depth arguments and all these Bible verses, it's in yesterday's video. But I basically draw the conclusion, what I think happened 2,000 years ago is that Paul thought he was having visions from a God, from his Messiah, but he was hallucinating. And there's lots of clues about this that I cover in yesterday's video that are in the scriptures. And so I basically see Paul and the first century Christians as a lot like your modern day Pentecostal services. I'm not saying all of them, but in a lot of Pentecostal services, you will see them, fall on the ground and shake, and or they'll be babbling in tongues and doing a lot of kind of things that look crazy, not only to other Christians, but to people who are not Christians. And I think the first century Christians and Paul were very much like that. And they thought that their Messiah, they were an apocalyptic cult, and they thought their Messiah was going to return in their lifetime. And of course it didn't happen. And this is all the proof you need that the Christian God doesn't exist. But Christians aren't going to agree with what I'm saying here. But I would encourage you that if you do have time to watch a nearly 2-hour video that I made yesterday, that I go into all these arguments, why you can't get around the time statements, and the arguments that the 99% try to use to get around them, but also how you can't spiritualize the resurrection that the full preterists try to do, and I go into their arguments and show why those don't work either. And when you put 2 and 2 together, you have to accept the time statements, and that Paul and the first century Christians believed their Messiah would come soon to change the world into paradise where there was no more death, no more suffering, and obviously that didn't happen, and this proves the Christian God does not exist. But this is the short version for those of you who that don't have time to watch a nearly 2-hour video, and I can completely understand that. But if you're interested in the in-depth arguments and the math equations and stuff I use with that, and they're just simple algebraic math equation. But if you're interested in all of that in depth, you can check out that video. But other than that, this is the summary. I hope it helps you. I know it's Friday, so hopefully you guys have a good weekend. Please stay safe out there, and then hopefully I will talk to you guys soon. Please take care.